The morning briefing at Naval Air Station Lemoore started like any other coffee-stained folders, the hum of fluorescent lights, and the low murmur of pilots discussing maintenance reports. Nobody noticed when she walked in. Captain Nora Kincaid moved through the room like smoke, her flight suit pressed to regulation perfection, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun that revealed a small scar above her left eyebrow. She took a seat in the back row, her hands folded on the table, her expression neutral. The instructor, Commander Hayes, was mid-sentence when one of the younger pilots, a fresh-faced lieutenant named Briggs, leaned toward his buddy and muttered something that ended with a smirk. The buddy laughed. Hayes continued talking about close air support protocols, but the whispers spread like wildfire through the junior officers. The new transfer, the diversity hire, the one with the weird call sign nobody understood. Kincaid didn't react. She'd heard worse. What they didn't know, what their personnel files and gossip chains hadn't told them, was that before she flew Super Hornets, before she logged combat hours over 3 continents, she'd spent 6 years in a world where silence meant survival and hesitation meant death. The SEAL teams didn't advertise their female operators. They didn't need to. The morning brief ended and pilots filtered toward the flight line. Kincaid grabbed her helmet bag and followed at a measured pace. 2 young officers blocked her path near the hangar entrance, their body language casual but their eyes sharp with challenge. "You Kincaid?" the taller one asked. His name tape read Morrison. "That's right. Heard you got some kind of special background," Morrison said, crossing his arms. "SEAL liaison or something. His partner, a stocky kid named Vasquez, grinned. "So what's your call sign?" They said it's weird. Kincaid looked at them both for a long moment, her face unreadable. "Revenant." Morrison blinked. "Like the movie, like the word." Vasquez laughed nervously. "That's dark. It's accurate." She moved past them without another word, leaving them standing in her wake. What they couldn't see, what the briefing room gossip and the locker room speculation never captured, was the 1,000-yard stare she wore like armor, the way her hands never quite relaxed, the careful distance she maintained between herself and everyone else. Revenant, one who returns from the dead. It wasn't a call sign she'd chosen. It was one she'd earned in a valley in Afghanistan, where her reconnaissance team had been declared KIA for 72 hours before she walked out of the mountains alone, carrying 2 dog tags that weren't hers and a bullet wound that should have killed her. The squadron's first flight rotation came 3 days later. Kincaid was assigned to a 4-ship formation, running interdiction drills over the Mojave Desert training range. Lead was Major Castellano, a 15-year veteran with silver in his temples and a reputation for running tight formations. His wingman was Captain Reeves, solid and dependable. The second element consisted of Kincaid and Lieutenant Morrison, the same Morrison from the hangar. The briefing was professional and thorough. Castellano laid out the scenario. Simulated ground convoy under attack, enemy air defense suppressed, multiple targets requiring precision strikes with live ordnance. Standard close air support package. Morrison kept glancing at Kincaid during the brief, his expression hovering between curiosity and doubt. When Castellano asked if there were questions, Morrison raised his hand. "Sir, just confirming, Revenant has CAS quals, right?" The room went quiet. Castellano's jaw tightened. "Captain Kincaid has more combat CAS hours than everyone in this room combined, Lieutenant. Focus on your own checklist." Morrison's face flushed, but he nodded. Kincaid said nothing. An hour later they were airborne, 4 FA-18 Super Hornets climbing through crystal blue sky, their gray and white camouflage paint schemes gleaming in the desert sun. Kincaid flew her aircraft with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory so deep it bypassed conscious thought. Her Super Hornet responded to her inputs like an extension of her nervous system, smooth, controlled, deliberate. The radio crackled with standard position calls. Castellano's voice was calm and measured as he led them toward the training range. Morrison flew decent formation, staying tucked in close to Kincaid's wing, but she could sense his tension through the way he made small corrections, overcompensating for turbulence. They reached the training area and Castellano called for the first attack run. The simulated convoy was marked by smoke generators on a dry lake bed, with pop-up targets representing enemy armor. Castellano and Reeves rolled in first, their aircraft diving toward the deck in perfect sequence, releasing training ordnance that kicked up geysers of dust. Then it was Kincaid's turn. "-3, you're cleared hot," Castellano transmitted. "-3 copies in hot." Kincaid rolled inverted and pulled her nose toward the earth, her eyes scanning the target area with the kind of focus that made everything else disappear. The Super Hornet systems fed her information: altitude, airspeed, angle of attack, weapon status, but she barely looked at the displays. She'd done this hundreds of times in environments where failure meant friendly casualties. The desert floor rushed up and she pickled her training bomb at precisely the right moment, pulling hard into a climbing turn that pressed her into her seat. The bomb impacted dead center on the primary target. Morrison followed, but his run was sloppy, too steep, too fast, his bomb falling long. Castellano didn't comment, but the silence spoke volumes. They ran 6 more attack profiles, each one building in complexity. Kincaid's performance was flawless, mechanical, almost unsettling in its consistency. Every bomb hit within meters of the target coordinates. Every radio call was crisp and professional. Every maneuver was textbook perfect. Morrison's flying improved as the sortie progressed, but he couldn't match her precision. By the 4th run, even he stopped trying to compete and just focused on not embarrassing himself. During the recovery leg back to Lemoore, Castellano's voice came over the tactical frequency. "-3, lead. Nice work out there." "Thank you, sir," Kincaid replied, her tone neutral. Morrison keyed his mic but said nothing, the silence stretching awkwardly before he released the button. Back on the ground, the debrief was professional and detailed. Castellano went through each run methodically, highlighting successes and areas for improvement. When he got to Morrison's long bomb on the 2nd run, he was diplomatic but firm. "-4, you were fast and steep. What happened?" Morrison glanced at Kincaid before answering. "I was trying to match -3's dive angle, sir. I misjudged. Don't fly someone else's jet, Lieutenant. Fly your own." "Yes, sir." When the debrief ended and pilots filtered out, Morrison lingered near the door. Kincaid was gathering her notes when he approached. "Hey," he said awkwardly. "That was some pretty solid flying." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Thanks. Where'd you learn to drop like that? That precise? Downrange?" "Right, the SEAL thing." Her eyes hardened slightly. "It's not a thing, Morrison, it's a job." He shifted his weight, suddenly uncomfortable. "I didn't mean, look, I'm sorry about the comments the other day. The diversity hire stuff, that was out of line." Kincaid studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Apology accepted." She walked past him toward the exit. Morrison watched her go, a look of confused respect on his face. In the ready room, Vasquez was waiting with a knowing grin. "How'd it go?" Morrison shook his head slowly. "She's not what I expected." Meaning I think we fucked up." Vasquez's grin faded. "What do you mean?" "I mean she flies like someone who's had people die because they missed, and I don't think she's forgotten any of them." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Outside, Kincaid walked across the flight line alone, her helmet bag over her shoulder, her eyes distant. The sun was setting over the California coast, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She'd flown well today, hit all her marks, done everything right, but it didn't feel like victory. It never did. The squadron operations tempo increased over the following weeks. Kincaid flew regularly, sometimes as wingman, sometimes as element lead, always with the same mechanical precision that left her peers quietly reassessing their assumptions. The whispers changed from skepticism to cautious respect, though few pilots tried to get close to her. She maintained her distance with the skill of someone who'd learned that emotional distance was a survival mechanism. Major Castellano noticed. He'd been in the Navy long enough to recognize trauma when it wore a flight suit. One afternoon he found her in the briefing room after hours, reviewing gun camera footage from a recent training sortie. "Kincaid," he said, stepping inside. "Got a minute?" She looked up from the laptop screen. "Sir." He sat down across from her, his expression thoughtful. "You settling in okay? I know transfers can be rough." "I'm fine, sir." "That's what everyone says." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I read your jacket before you arrived. Not just the official stuff. I made some calls." Her face remained neutral, but something shifted behind her eyes. And I know you didn't come from a normal aviation pipeline. I know you spent time in places most aviators never see and did things most of us can't imagine. Castellano leaned forward slightly. I also know that transition can be harder than the combat itself. Kincaid's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I appreciate the concern, sir, but I'm managing. I'm not questioning your performance. You're one of the best stick-and-rudder pilots I've ever seen. He met her gaze directly. I'm asking if you're okay. For a long moment she didn't answer. Outside, a Super Hornet lit its engines for an evening training flight, the howl of the turbines bleeding through the walls. I'm where I need to be, she finally said. Flying keeps things simple. Castellano nodded slowly. Fair enough. But if that changes, my door's open. No judgment, no paperwork, just conversation. Understood, sir. He stood to leave but paused at the door. Your call sign, Revenant, I looked it up after that first training flight, one who returns from the dead. He turned back to face her. That was Kabul province, wasn't it? The recon team they declared KIA? Kincaid's expression didn't change, but her hands went very still on the laptop keyboard. Sir, I'm not asking for details. I just want you to know that whatever happened out there, whatever you had to do to survive it, doesn't define your worth here. His voice was gentle but firm. You're not a ghost, Captain. You're a pilot, a damn good one. He left before she could respond. The call came at 02:30 on a Tuesday morning. Kincaid was already awake. She usually was at that hour, her sleep patterns permanently disrupted by years of midnight operations, when her phone buzzed with an alert. Emergency recall. All pilots report to operations immediately. She dressed quickly, her mind shifting into the calm focus that came automatically now. Whatever this was, it wasn't a drill. The ops center was controlled chaos when she arrived. Pilots streaming in from the BOQ still pulling on flight suits, the duty officer coordinating with someone on a secure line. Castellano stood near the main display screen, his face grim. As pilots assembled, he called for attention. Listen up. 20 minutes ago, a civilian airliner reported losing contact with a small private jet over the Nevada desert. FAA tracked it descending rapidly before losing transponder. Last known position puts it near the Nellis Range complex, which means we've got potential ordnance hazards and restricted airspace complications. He brought up a map on the screen showing the projected crash site. Search and rescue is spinning up, but we're the closest tactical aviation assets. We're launching a 2-ship to locate and assess. Rules of engagement are simple. Find the aircraft, determine if there are survivors, coordinate rescue assets. Morrison raised his hand. Sir, why not wait for dedicated SAR? Because the jet was carrying a congressional delegation returning from a classified facility tour. State Department wants eyes on site now, not in 3 hours. The room went silent. Political complications meant media attention, which meant scrutiny, which meant zero margin for error. Castellano's eyes swept the room and landed on Kincaid. Revenant, your lead. You've got desert search experience that matters here. She nodded once. Yes, sir. -2 will be. He scanned the assembled pilots. Reeves, you've got the most recent night systems quals. Captain Reeves stepped forward. Yes, sir. Brief, fast, launch in 30 questions. There were none. 15 minutes later, Kincaid and Reeves were in the paraloft pulling on survival gear and checking equipment. The night vision goggles were tested, communication systems verified, emergency procedures reviewed. Reeves was a solid pilot, professional and unflappable, exactly who you'd want on your wing for a night search mission. In the aircraft, Kincaid ran through her pre-flight with practiced efficiency. The Super Hornet's cockpit was familiar territory, every switch and display memorized through repetition. She brought systems online, checked weapons status. They were carrying only training rounds and flares, nothing kinetic, and verified her targeting pod was operational. -2-1, comm check. -2 reads you Lima Charlie. Copy. Let's go find some people. They taxied together through the darkness, their aircraft's navigation lights cutting red and green paths across the tarmac. The takeoff was smooth, both jets lifting off into the moonless night and climbing toward the Nevada border. At altitude, The world below was an abstract pattern of lights, highways, towns, the distant glow of Las Vegas against the vast emptiness of the desert. Kincaid's radar showed clear skies, and her navigation systems fed her constant updates on their position relative to the last known coordinates of the missing aircraft. Dash 2 lead. Say fuel state. Dash 2 shows bingo plus 2 hours. Good for extended search. Copy. We'll run a standard search pattern from the last known coordinates. You take north quadrants, I'll take south. Keep your targeting pod hot and call anything that looks like wreckage or distress signals. Dash 2 copies. They reached the search area 18 minutes after takeoff. Kincaid rolled inverted and pulled her nose down, descending toward the desert floor while scanning with both her radar and targeting pod. The terrain below was a nightmare for search operations. Thousands of square miles of rocky hills, dry lake beds, and scattered vegetation that all looked the same through infrared. She methodized her search pattern with the same discipline she'd used in Afghanistan when searching for enemy positions. Grid by grid, quadrant by quadrant, eyes moving constantly between her displays and the darkness outside. Her targeting pod's infrared sensor painted the world in shades of green and white, highlighting temperature differences that might indicate recent impact. 30 minutes passed, then 45. Nothing. Reeves called in negative contacts from his sector. Kincaid expanded her search area, pushing farther from the projected coordinates. Something wasn't right. The math didn't work. If the jet had descended rapidly from its last reported altitude, it should be somewhere within this radius. Unless the descent wasn't as rapid as reported, unless the pilot had tried to glide it in, she keyed her mic. Dash 2 lead. I'm extending south-southwest. Pilot might have tried for a controlled landing. Dash 2 concurs, adjusting my pattern northwest. Kincaid banked her Super Hornet and dove lower, pushing the edge of safe altitude over mountainous terrain. Her eyes scanned the infrared display, looking for anomalies, anything that didn't belong in the natural pattern of cooling rocks and sparse vegetation. Then she saw it. A thermal signature. Faint but distinct heat differential consistent with cooling, jet fuel, and metal that had been subjected to extreme friction. She rolled wings level and brought her targeting pod to bear on the coordinates. The image resolved slowly through the infrared haze. Aircraft wreckage. Scattered across a shallow canyon, the fuselage broken into several large pieces. But no fire, no massive explosion. The impact had been relatively controlled. Dash 2 lead. I have wreckage. Grid November Victor 7348. Multiple pieces, no visible fire. Reeves responded immediately. Dash 2 is moving to your position. Do you see survivors? Kincaid zoomed her targeting pod, scanning the wreckage carefully. She focused her targeting pod on the scattered wreckage, methodically scanning each section of the destroyed aircraft. The fuselage had broken into 3 major pieces. The cockpit section relatively intact but canted at a severe angle, the center fuselage shattered and spread across 50 meters of rocky terrain, and the tail section resting upside down against a boulder outcropping. What she saw next made her breath catch. Movement. Subtle but definite. A thermal signature near the cockpit section that was too warm, too localized to be residual engine heat. Human body temperature. Dash 2 lead. I have possible survivors, at least one thermal signature moving near the forward fuselage. Dash 2 has visual on your position. Confirm survivors. Kincaid adjusted her altitude, circling the crash site in a wide orbit while keeping her sensors locked on target. Affirmative. I count at least one person ambulatory near the cockpit. Stand by. She switched frequencies to contact the Rescue Coordination Center. Falcon SAR-1, we have located the crash site. Grid November Victor 7348. Multiple thermal signatures indicating survivors, requesting immediate medevac. The SAR controller's voice came back crisp and professional. Dash 1, Falcon SAR copies crash site located. Be advised nearest medevac helo is 45 minutes out. Can you maintain overhead coverage? Affirmative. We have fuel for 90 minutes on station. Copy. Helo flight is launching now. Maintain visual contact and relay any changes to survivor status. Kincaid acknowledged and went back to tactical frequency. -2, we're overhead until the cavalry arrives. I'm going to do a low pass with landing lights to signal the survivors. -2 copies. I'll maintain high cover. She rolled her Super Hornet into a descent, dropping to 300 feet above the canyon floor, dangerously low for night operations over terrain, but she'd flown lower in worse conditions. As she approached the wreckage site, she toggled her landing lights, the brilliant white beams cutting through the darkness and illuminating the crash scene in harsh detail. The response was immediate. Someone on the ground activated a flashlight, waving it in the universal signal for distress. Then another light appeared. And another, 3 people, at least 3 survivors. Kincaid pulled up sharply, her engines roaring off the canyon walls. -2 lead, confirmed 3 survivors on the ground, all apparently mobile. They're signaling with flashlights. -2 copies 3 survivors. Outstanding work, lead. She climbed back to a safer altitude and resumed her orbit, keeping her targeting pod locked on the crash site. Time became elastic, each minute stretching as she watched the thermal signatures below, praying they wouldn't see those signatures go still and cold. Reeves maintained his position above and behind her, providing radio relay to the SAR center and monitoring fuel states. 35 minutes after locating the crash, Kincaid heard the distinctive sound of rotor blades echoing through her radio. -1, Falcon 2-3, we have visual on your position. Falcon 2-3-1. Survivors are at the forward section of the wreckage. Be advised, terrain is extremely rocky. Recommend approach from the west. The medevac helicopter, a Navy MH-60 Sierra, descended into the canyon with its searchlight blazing. Kincaid watched through her targeting pod as the crew worked with impressive efficiency, fast ropes deployed, rescue swimmers on the ground within seconds, survivors being evaluated and prepared for extraction. The whole operation took less than 10 minutes. As the helicopter lifted off with all 3 survivors secured aboard, the pilot transmitted his thanks. -1, Falcon 2-3. Good eyes on the crash site. These folks owe you their lives. Just doing the job, Falcon. Glad we found them in time. Kincaid and Reeves maintained their orbit until a second helicopter arrived to secure the crash site for investigation. Only then did Castellano, monitoring from ops back at Lemoore, give them clearance to return to base. The flight back was quiet. Kincaid's adrenaline was fading, replaced by the familiar emptiness that always followed high-stress operations. She'd done what needed doing. People were alive because of it. But the satisfaction was distant, abstract, like watching someone else's victory through bulletproof glass. They landed as the sun was rising over the Sierras, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. The maintenance crews were waiting, along with what looked like half the squadron. As Kincaid shut down her engines and popped her canopy, she saw Castellano approaching with several other officers. She climbed down the ladder, her legs stiff from 3 hours in the cockpit. Castellano reached her first, his expression one of genuine respect. Hell of a job out there, Kincaid. The SAR coordinator said you located them in terrain where they expected it to take hours. We got lucky with the search pattern, sir. Luck had nothing to do with it. He glanced at the assembled pilots. The congressional aide who was on that flight. She's apparently the daughter of the Secretary of Defense. You just saved a lot of careers along with those lives. Kincaid nodded but said nothing. Recognition and praise had never been her motivation. Morrison pushed through the crowd, his earlier skepticism completely absent. Revenant, that was incredible flying, 300 feet over that terrain in the dark. Just needed to signal them. Still, he hesitated, then extended his hand. I was wrong about you, completely wrong. She shook his hand, her grip firm. Happens. As the crowd began to disperse, Reeves approached with a tired smile. You drink coffee, Revenant. Constantly. Good, buy you a cup and you can tell me how you learned to search like that, because whatever they teach in flight school isn't producing that level of skill. For the first time, something that might have been a smile touched the corner of Kincaid's mouth. Deal, but it's a long story. I've got time. They walked toward the ready room together as the sun climbed higher, burning off the last shadows of night. The official commendation came 3 days later during a squadron formation. Captain Nora Kincaid stood at attention while Commodore Wright, the Air Wing commander, read the citation for distinguished flying cross-rapid response, exceptional airmanship, direct life-saving action under challenging conditions. The words washed over her like white noise. She'd heard similar citations before in different uniforms for different actions. They never quite captured what it felt like in the moment, the focus, the fear held at arm's length, the weight of knowing that failure meant death. When Wright pinned the medal to her service dress uniform, the assembled squadron erupted in applause. Kincaid maintained her bearing, accepting handshakes and congratulations with the same neutral professionalism she brought to everything. But later, alone in her BOQ room, she placed the medal in her sock drawer without ceremony, adding it to the 3 others she'd earned in another lifetime. The seal trident rested there too, wrapped in a black cloth she never looked at if she could avoid it. Physical reminders of ghosts she'd rather forget. The knock on her door came just after 1900 hours. She opened it to find Morrison and Vasquez standing in the hallway, both in civilian clothes, looking awkward. "Hey," Morrison said. "We're grabbing food off base. Thought you might want to join." Kincaid's instinct was to decline. Isolation was safer, but something in their faces' genuine invitation rather than obligation made her pause. "Where?" "This taco place in town, nothing fancy. Reeves is coming too. Give me 5 minutes." The restaurant was exactly what Morrison had promised, nothing fancy, just good food and cold drinks and the kind of relaxed atmosphere that made conversation easy. For the first hour, they talked about flying, swapping stories about close calls and maintenance nightmares, and the eternal frustration of dealing with wing ops scheduling. Kincaid found herself actually laughing at Vasquez's impression of their executive officer's briefing style. But eventually, inevitably, the conversation turned personal. "So what's the story with the SEAL background?" Vasquez asked, his tone curious rather than challenging. "We've all heard bits and pieces, but nothing concrete." Kincaid took a long drink of her beer before answering. "I was a combat controller attached to Team 3, reconnaissance, target coordination, close air support liaison. Did it for 6 years before transitioning to aviation." "That's where you got the call sign," Reeves said. "Something that happened downrange." She nodded slowly. "Afghanistan, Helmand Province. My team got compromised during a mission and we had to exfil under fire. Things went bad. We got separated in the mountains and command lost contact." Morrison leaned forward. "The 72 hours thing, we heard about that. 72 hours declared KIA before I made it to a forward operating base." Her voice was matter-of-fact, clinical. "3 of my team didn't make it out. I carried their tags for 40 miles through enemy territory." The table went quiet. Vasquez broke the silence carefully. "Jesus, Revenant, I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." Reeves studied her face with the careful attention of someone who recognized trauma when it wore a calm mask. "Is that why you fly like someone's keeping score? Like every mission has to be perfect?" Kincaid's jaw tightened slightly. "I fly the way I was trained." "No," Reeves said gently. "You fly like you're still carrying their tags, like if you make one mistake, more people die." The observation hit closer than she wanted to admit. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Man, that's heavy." "It's reality," Kincaid said. "In the teams, mistakes cost lives. That lesson doesn't just go away because you change uniforms." Vasquez raised his beer bottle. "Well, for what it's worth, I'm glad you're on our side, and I'm sorry for being a dick when you first got here." "Same," Morrison added. "We judged you without knowing anything. That was wrong." Kincaid looked at the 3 of them, these pilots who'd gone from skeptics to something approaching friends in the span of a few weeks. "Apology accepted." "Both of you." The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, but something had changed. The wall she'd maintained since arriving at Lemoore had developed a crack, not much but enough. When they left the restaurant hours later, Morrison clapped her on the shoulder. "We should do this again. Maybe you can teach us some of those search patterns you used to find that crash site." "Maybe," she said, "if you're willing to learn." "Are you kidding? After watching you work, I'll take any lesson you're offering." They parted ways in the parking lot, and Kincaid drove back to base alone, the night air cool through her open windows. For the first time since transferring to the squadron, she felt something other than the constant vigilance that had defined her existence. Not quite peace. That was probably too much to hope for, but something adjacent to it. a sense of belonging that she'd thought died in those Afghan mountains along with her teammates. Back in her BOQ room, she pulled out the sock drawer and looked at the medals and the trident. Her fingers traced the eagle clutching the trident and pistol, the same insignia that hundreds of warriors wore with pride. She tried to leave this identity behind when she pinned on wings, tried to become someone new, someone whose past didn't follow her like a shadow. But maybe that was the wrong approach. Maybe the point wasn't to forget who she'd been. Maybe it was to integrate it, to accept that Revenant the SEAL and Revenant the pilot were the same person, just different chapters of the same story. She placed the medals back in the drawer but left it open. Tomorrow she'd fly again. Tomorrow she'd continue proving herself, not because she needed their respect anymore, but because excellence was the only standard she knew. And maybe, just maybe, she'd stop running from the ghost she'd been and learn to live with the woman she'd become. The following weeks settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Kincaid flew regularly, sometimes leading, sometimes as wingman, always with the same precision that had become her trademark. But the subtle shift in squadron dynamics was undeniable. Pilots who'd once viewed her with skepticism now sought her input during mission planning. Junior officers asked questions about tactical approaches. Even the maintenance crews started calling her by her call sign instead of her rank, a sign of acceptance in the tribal culture of naval aviation. Major Castellano noticed the change and quietly approved. During one afternoon brief, he assigned Kincaid as division lead for a complex training evolution-simulated strike package against a heavily defended target, requiring coordination between multiple aircraft, tanker support, and precise timing. It was the kind of mission profile that typically went to senior majors or lieutenant commanders, not a captain with only a few months in the squadron. Morrison, assigned as her wingman, caught her after the brief. "You ready for this? That's a lot of moving parts." "It's fine," Kincaid said, already reviewing the mission timeline. "We've got good pilots and a straightforward objective, just need to execute." "That's it, just execute," she looked up from her notes. "What else would there be?" Morrison laughed. "I don't know, maybe acknowledge that you're basically running the show on this one. That's a vote of confidence from Castellano. He assigned me a mission, I'll fly it." "Man, you really don't do compliments, do you?" Something that might have been amusement flickered in her eyes. "Not particularly." The mission launched 2 days later, a 6-ship strike package with Kincaid leading the first section, Reeves leading the second, and Castellano flying high cover with the ops officer. The objective was a simulated command and control facility defended by multiple surface-to-air missile sites and enemy fighters played by the adversary squadron from Fallen. Everything had to work perfectly for the strike to succeed. During the brief, Kincaid walked through the timeline with methodical precision. She covered ingress routes, communication protocols, weapons employment sequences, and contingency plans for every likely complication. Her presentation was clear, comprehensive, and delivered with the kind of confidence that came from having done similar missions when failure meant actual death. When she finished, Castellano asked if there were questions. Lieutenant Kim, one of the newer pilots, raised his hand. "What if the adversary changes their CAP pattern and we get intercepted during approach?" Kincaid didn't hesitate. "We adapt. If they come high, we go low and use terrain masking. If they come low, we split the package and force them to commit to one element while the other continues to target. The objective doesn't change, just the route to get there." "And if we lose communications?" another pilot asked. "Continue on timeline using per-brief checkpoints. Everyone knows their role. Radio failure doesn't mean mission failure, it just means we work quiet." Castellano nodded approvingly. Any other questions? There were none. They walked to the aircraft 2 hours later. Kincaid strapped into her Super Hornet and ran through pre-flight checks with the same ritual attention she brought to every flight. The aircraft was immaculate. Her crew chief, a senior petty officer named Rodriguez, took personal pride in maintaining Revenant's jet. He climbed the ladder to do final checks before she started engines. "Plane's ready, ma'am," Rodriguez said. "Brought you back clean." "Thanks, Chief. Good work. You bring her back the same way." "Always do." The 6-ship formation launched in sequence, climbing through scattered clouds toward the working area. Kincaid's tactical display showed all aircraft in position, systems green, weapons loaded with training rounds that would simulate everything from small-diameter bombs to JDAMs. They topped off fuel from an Air Force tanker, then turned toward the simulated target area. The first indication that this wouldn't be a standard training run came 15 minutes into the approach. Strike lead, Bandits. Bandits northeast, 20 miles, high aspect. The controller's voice was professional but urgent. Kincaid checked her radar and saw them 4 adversary F-16s approaching faster and higher than the pre-brief scenario called for. They were deviating from the training plan, throwing a curveball to test her response. Strike package lead. Bandits inbound early. Dash 5 and 6, your weapons free to engage. Rest of package continues on timeline. Castellano and the ops officer broke off to intercept the adversary fighters, buying time and space for the strike elements. Kincaid continued leading her 4-ship toward the target, descending toward the mountain terrain that would mask them from simulated SAM radars. Dash 2, press with me. Dash 3 and 4, split right and use the valley approach. We hit target from 2 axes. Reeves acknowledged immediately, his voice calm. Dash 3 copies, taking the valley. Time on target in 3 minutes. Check weapons. 4 confirmations came back. Kincaid's eyes moved constantly between her tactical display, the terrain below, and the countdown timer on her mission computer. The mountains rushed past her canopy, peaks and valleys forming a maze that she navigated with the kind of situational awareness that came from years of low-level flying. 2 minutes out, another call. Strike lead, Skyfall. Simulated SAM radar active, Site Bravo. A new threat, not in the pre-briefed scenario. Someone was stress-testing her decision-making. Dash 2, flow, will suppress Bravo on approach. Dash 3, continue direct to target. Dash 3, continuing. Kincaid adjusted her flight path, bringing her Super Hornet into position to engage the simulated SAM site with anti-radiation missiles. Morrison flew perfect formation on her wing, anticipating her maneuvers. They rippled their training rounds at the simulated radar site, then dove back toward the primary target. 1 minute to weapons release. All aircraft lead. Stand by for coordinated strike on my mark. She counted down the seconds, watching her displays, ensuring all 4 strike aircraft were in position. The timing had to be perfect for maximum effect in the simulation. 3, 2, 1, mark. 4 aircraft released weapons simultaneously from different approach angles. The mission controller's voice came through neutral but with an undertone of surprise. Strike lead, Skyfall. All weapons effective. Target destroyed. Time on target within 2 seconds of planned. Recommend recovery. Kincaid keyed her mic. Strike package lead. Good work. Form on me for recovery. The 6 Super Hornets reformed and headed back toward Lemoore, the adrenaline of the simulated combat slowly fading into the routine work of formation flying and fuel management. In her cockpit, Kincaid allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. They'd adapted to multiple complications, maintained timeline discipline, and executed the strike exactly as planned. But the real victory was watching junior pilots rise to the challenge, making good decisions under pressure. That's what leadership looked like, not demanding perfection, but enabling excellence. The debrief lasted 2 hours. Castellano went through every phase of the mission methodically, praising what worked and identifying areas for improvement. When he got to Kincaid's decision to split the formation and adapt to the SAM threat, he stopped and addressed the room. This is what good mission lead looks like. Captain Kincaid maintained objective focus, adapted to changing threats, and trusted her wingmen to execute without micromanaging. She gave clear instructions and let skilled pilots do their jobs. He looked directly at her. That's textbook tactical leadership. Well done. The assembled pilots nodded, several glancing at Kincaid with new respect. She accepted the praise with a simple nod, uncomfortable as always with recognition but professional enough to acknowledge it. After the debrief, Reeves cornered her near the coffee machine. You made that look easy. It wasn't. Good people make it easy, Kincaid said. You flew a perfect intercept approach. Kim and Vasquez nailed their timing. Morrison stayed glued to my wing through some rough maneuvering. I just coordinated. That's leadership, coordinating good people toward a common objective. He paused, stirring his coffee. You ever think about weapons school? She blinked, surprised. What? Weapons school, instructor duty. You've got the knowledge and the skill, and more importantly, you've got the combat experience to make it relevant. Navy needs instructors who have actually employed weapons downrange, not just training ranges. I haven't thought about it. You should talk to Castellano. He's got the connections to make it happen. Kincaid considered this, her expression thoughtful. Teaching had never been on her radar. She'd always seen herself as the soldier, the operator, not the instructor. But maybe there was value in passing along hard-won lessons. Maybe that was how you honored the people you'd lost by ensuring the next generation didn't make the same mistakes. Maybe I will, she said quietly. That evening she found herself in Castellano's office, having knocked on his door after hours. He looked up from his paperwork with surprise. Kincaid, come in. What's on your mind? She sat down across from his desk. Reeves mentioned weapons school, instructor duty. Castellano leaned back in his chair, a knowing smile crossing his face. Did he now? Is that something you think I should pursue? Castellano took a moment before answering, his expression shifting from casual to serious. I'll be direct with you, Kincaid. I've already put your name forward for consideration. The weapons school board meets in 3 months, and I wrote you a letter of recommendation 2 weeks ago. She blinked, genuinely surprised. Sir, you're exactly what that program needs. Combat experience, tactical acumen, and more importantly, the ability to make complex decisions under pressure while keeping other people alive. Those are the instructors who actually make a difference. He pulled out a folder from his desk drawer and slid it across to her. This is the application package. It's not a guarantee the selection process is competitive and they'll dig deep into your background, but I think you've got a real shot. Kincaid opened the folder and scanned the requirements. Advanced tactical qualifications, combat deployments, peer recommendations, commanding officer endorsement. She had all of it. What she didn't have was certainty that she wanted this path. Teaching meant staying in one place, putting down roots, investing emotionally in students who'd eventually deploy and face the same dangers she'd survived. I need to think about it, she said. Fair enough, but don't think too long. The board deadline is 6 weeks out. She took the folder and stood. Thank you, sir, for the recommendation and the opportunity. You earned it, Revenant, multiple times over. Back in her quarters, she spread the application materials across her small desk and stared at them for a long time. The sealed trident watched from the open sock drawer like a silent witness. Weapons school represented a commitment to staying in the Navy, building a career, becoming part of the institution rather than just passing through. It meant accepting that she had value beyond the cockpit, that her experience could serve a larger purpose. It also meant confronting the parts of her past she'd tried to compartmentalize. The board would interview her extensively. They'd ask about her SEAL background, about Afghanistan, about how she'd survived when others hadn't. They'd want to know if she could handle the pressure of shaping the next generation of combat aviators. Could she? The question sat heavy in her mind. She'd spent so long building walls, maintaining distance, treating each mission as a discrete event with no emotional investment. Teaching required the opposite connection, investment, vulnerability. It required believing that the future was worth the pain of remembering the past. Her phone buzzed with a text from Morrison. Beer's off base tomorrow. Reeves, Vasquez, and Kim are in. She typed back a response. I'm in. Then she turned back to the application materials and started reading. If she was going to do this, she'd do it right. Excellence was the only standard she knew. 3 days later, she submitted her completed application through the chain of command. Castellano reviewed it quickly and added his endorsement without changing a word. The board's going to love you, he said, or they'll think I'm too much baggage. Baggage implies something useless you're carrying around. What you've got is experience. There's a difference. She nodded slowly. I hope you're right, sir. I usually am. Now get out of here and go fly. We've got a training hop this afternoon and I want to see if you can keep up with an old man. She smiled an actual smile. Challenge accepted, sir. The Weapons School Board convened 8 weeks later at Naval Air Station Fallon, Nevada. Kincaid flew commercial to Reno and drove the hour south through high desert country, watching the mountains rise stark and beautiful against crystalline blue sky. Fallon was the heart of naval aviation advanced training, where the best pilots came to learn how to be better, and where future instructors were forged through rigorous evaluation. The interview process lasted 3 days. Kincaid faced panels of senior officers, demonstrated tactical knowledge through complex scenario planning, flew evaluation sorties with instructor pilots who'd seen everything, and sat through psychological evaluations designed to ensure candidates could handle the unique pressures of teaching combat tactics. On the second day, she found herself in a small conference room facing a captain and 2 commanders, all of them experienced weapons school graduates who'd served as instructors. The captain, a lean man named Valdez with combat patches from 3 deployments, opened the questioning. "Captain Kincaid, your record shows 6 years as a SEAL combat controller before transitioning to aviation. That's an unusual pipeline. Walk us through why you made that change." She'd prepared for this question, but delivering the answer still required effort. "I watched 3 members of my team die in Afghanistan because our close air support coordination broke down under pressure. The aircraft were overhead, the weapons were available, but the communication failed and we couldn't get ordnance on target when we needed it." Her voice remained steady. "I decided I wanted to be the one dropping bombs, not just calling them in. If I could fly, I could ensure the coordination worked. I could control one more variable." One of the commanders, a woman named Porter with graying hair and sharp eyes, leaned forward. "That's a heavy burden to carry. The belief that you could have changed the outcome if only you'd been in the cockpit instead of on the ground." "Yes, ma'am." "Do you still carry it?" Kincaid met her gaze directly. "Every day." "How does that affect your flying?" "It makes me precise. It makes me careful with other people's lives. It makes me treat every mission like someone's survival depends on getting it exactly right." Captain Valdez studied her face. "That kind of pressure can burn people out. How do you handle the stress?" "By being better, by learning from mistakes, by never accepting good enough when excellent is possible." He nodded slowly. "And if you become an instructor, how would you teach students who haven't experienced combat, who don't carry your particular burdens?" This was the crucial question. Kincaid took a breath before answering. "I'd teach them that the standards aren't arbitrary, that the checklists and procedures and attention to detail aren't bureaucratic busywork, they're survival mechanisms developed through decades of people making mistakes and learning from them. I'd teach them that when they're overhead a team on the ground, those aren't just coordinates on a targeting pod. They're people whose lives depend on precision." She paused. "And I'd teach them that excellence isn't about personal glory. It's about ensuring everyone comes home." Commander Porter's expression softened slightly. "That's a good answer, Captain." The third day included flight evaluations. Kincaid flew 3 sorties with instructor pilots, each designed to evaluate different aspects of her capabilities. The first was a complex strike mission requiring her to plan and lead a 4-ship against multiple targets with simulated threats. She briefed the mission with methodical precision, executed flawlessly, and adapted smoothly when the evaluators threw complications at her. The second sortie tested her ability to teach in the air, flying with a student who deliberately made mistakes that she had to identify and correct through real-time coaching. She recognized every error, provided clear guidance without being condescending, and demonstrated patience even when the student repeated mistakes. The third flight was pure dogfighting, basic fighter maneuvering against an experienced adversary pilot who'd seen hundreds of students try to best him. Kincaid flew with aggression tempered by discipline, pressing attacks when opportunities presented but never overcommitting to the point of vulnerability. She didn't win. The adversary instructor was simply too skilled, but she made him work for it, and more importantly, she demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking that could be taught to others. Back on the ground, sweaty and exhausted, she faced the evaluator instructor. His call sign was Hammer, and he had a reputation for being brutally honest. "You flew well, Revenant," he said. "Not perfectly, but well. More importantly, you flew smart. You know when to push and when to reset. That's the mark of someone who's been shot at for real." "Thank you, sir. But here's what I need to know. Can you teach a 23-year-old nugget fresh out of flight school why those decisions matter? Can you convey the weight of responsibility without crushing them under it?" Kincaid considered this carefully. I think so, sir. Because I remember being that nugget before Afghanistan. I remember thinking I was invincible, that skills and confidence were enough. I learned differently, and that lesson cost people their lives. If I can help even one pilot understand the stakes before they face that choice, it's worth whatever emotional toll it takes. Hammer nodded slowly. Good answer. The board will make their decision within 2 weeks. You'll be notified through your command. Understood, sir. She flew back to Lemoore the next afternoon, emotionally drained but oddly hopeful. The board had pushed her hard, forced her to articulate things she'd never put into words, but she'd held her ground. Whatever happened next was out of her control. The notification came 13 days later. Kincaid was in the briefing room reviewing training schedules when Castellano walked in holding a sealed envelope. His face was unreadable, but something in his eyes suggested he already knew what it contained. This came through official channels about an hour ago, he said, handing her the envelope. Figured you'd want to open it somewhere private, but I couldn't wait to find you. She took the envelope, her heart rate increasing despite her attempt to maintain composure. The return address was Naval Strike and Air Warfare Center, Fallon, Nevada. With steady hands, she opened it and pulled out the single-page letter. Captain Nora Kincaid, you are hereby selected for assignment as an instructor at the Naval Strike and Air Warfare Center Weapons School, effective 6 months from date of this letter. Report date. She read it twice to be certain it was real. I got it, she said quietly. Castellano's face broke into a genuine smile. I knew you would. Congratulations, Revenant. Well deserved. She looked up from the letter. Thank you, sir, for the recommendation, for the opportunity, for believing I could do this. I didn't give you anything you hadn't earned. The news spread through the squadron quickly. By evening, pilots were congratulating her in the hallways and the ready room. Morrison organized an impromptu celebration at the same taco place where they'd first shared stories weeks earlier. This time the gathering was larger, a dozen pilots, several maintenance chiefs, even some administrative staff who'd quietly supported her since she arrived. Kincaid found herself at the center of attention, uncomfortable but grateful. Reeves raised his beer bottle for a toast. To Revenant. May her students learn half of what she knows and still be the best pilots in the fleet. Hear, hear, the group responded, clinking bottles and glasses. Vasquez leaned across the table. So what's it like, knowing you're going to be teaching the best of the best? Terrifying, Kincaid admitted. These will be pilots who are already good. My job is helping them become great while keeping them alive long enough to matter. You'll be perfect at it, Morrison said. You've already been teaching us, whether you realized it or not. Every time you brief a mission or debrief our mistakes, we're learning from someone who's been there and survived. That's invaluable. Kim, the younger pilot who'd asked questions during her strike lead brief, spoke up. Can I ask something about your call sign? Sure. I know the basic story, that you were declared KIA and came back. But what was it like, those 72 hours? The table went quiet. This was the question everyone wanted to ask, but nobody dared. Kincaid took a long drink of her beer before answering. It was the worst 72 hours of my life. Cold, painful, terrifying. I was injured, running low on ammunition, completely alone in hostile territory. Every sound was a potential enemy. Every shadow could be death. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But what I remember most wasn't the fear. It was the clarity. I had one mission: get home and bring their tags back so their families would know what happened to them. Everything else fell away. No politics, no career concerns, no wondering if I was good enough. Just survival and honor, pure simplicity in the worst possible circumstances. How'd you keep going? Vasquez asked. I made a promise to 3 dead men. Breaking it wasn't an option. The weight of her words settled over the group. Morrison broke the silence. And now you're going to teach people how to make good decisions under pressure. There's poetry in that. Or trauma repetition, Kincaid said with dark humor. My therapist would probably have opinions. That got a laugh, breaking the tension. The conversation shifted to lighter topics: deployment stories, maintenance nightmares, the eternal mystery of what the galley called meat. But something had fundamentally changed. These pilots weren't just colleagues anymore. They were something approaching friends, people she trusted, people who understood what she carried and didn't judge her for the weight. Later, as the group was dispersing, Castellano pulled her aside in the parking lot. "I've been meaning to tell you something," he said. "When your orders came through for this assignment, I made some calls to people I know at Fallen, asked what they thought of you after the board. And one of the evaluators told me you were the most technically proficient candidate they'd seen in years. But what sealed it was your answer about why you wanted to teach, about ensuring everyone comes home." Kincaid nodded. "That's the only thing that matters, sir." The remaining months at Lemoore passed in a blur of flying, preparation, and surprising emotional investment in the squadron that had become her home. Kincaid flew lead on increasingly complex training missions, mentoring junior pilots with the same precision she brought to everything. But now there was something else in her instruction, a willingness to be vulnerable, to share hard-won lessons from Afghanistan and from her mistakes. She started joining pilots for coffee after flights, answering questions about combat experience, about decision-making under fire, about how to carry responsibility without letting it crush you. Morrison became something like her protege, absorbing tactical knowledge with the enthusiasm of someone who finally understood what excellence looked like. Reeves continued to be a steady presence, offering wisdom from his own 15 years in the fleet. Even Vasquez, once skeptical, became one of her most vocal advocates. One afternoon, she found herself in the paraloft helping a new Nugget pilot named Ensign Torres prep for his first carrier qualification. He was nervous, fumbling with his survival gear, clearly overwhelmed by the approaching challenge. "Take a breath," Kincaid said, her voice calm. "You've trained for this. You know how to fly the ball, you know the procedures. Trust your training. But what if I screw up? What if I miss the wire or go into the water?" She met his eyes directly. "Then you eject and the helo picks you up and you try again. But that won't happen because you're going to focus on one moment at a time. Not the entire landing, just the next step. Approach corridor, lineup, ball call, power corrections. One step, then the next, then the next. Before you know it, you're on deck and your heart rate drops and you realize you just did something most people only dream about." Torres took a shaky breath. "How do you stay calm? Everyone says you never get rattled." "I get rattled all the time," she admitted. "I just don't let it change what I do. Fear is information, not instruction. It tells you the stakes are high, which you already knew. It doesn't tell you how to fly." "Was it like that in Afghanistan when things went bad?" She paused, considering how much to share. "Yes, I was terrified the entire 72 hours, but terror doesn't negotiate, it just is. So I acknowledged it and kept moving, one step at a time, focusing on what I could control." Torres nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Thank you, ma'am, that helps. You're going to do fine, Ensign. And when you trap your first wire, buy your maintenance crew around. They're the reason that aircraft works." The kid smiled. "Yes, ma'am." Watching him walk toward his aircraft with renewed confidence, Kincaid felt something unfamiliar, satisfaction that wasn't tied to personal performance, but to helping someone else succeed. Maybe teaching was exactly where she needed to be. 2 weeks before her transfer date, Castellano organized a formal hail and farewell. The ready room was packed with current and former squadron members, maintenance chiefs, operations staff, even the air wing commander. Kincaid stood near the front, uncomfortable with the attention but professional enough to accept it gracefully. Commodore Wright spoke first, reviewing her service record and praising her impact on the squadron. Then Castellano took the podium. "I've been in naval aviation for 23 years, he began. "I've flown with hundreds of pilots, trained dozens, commanded a fair number. What makes someone truly great isn't just skill in the cockpit, it's character. The willingness to put the mission and the team before personal glory. The discipline to maintain standards even when it's hard. The courage to be vulnerable enough to teach." Castellano's voice carried weight that silenced the room completely. Captain Kincaid arrived at this squadron with a reputation that preceded her SEAL background, combat experience, a call sign that suggested someone who'd seen things most of us only train for. Some people wondered if she'd fit in, if she'd be able to transition from that world to ours. He paused, his gaze sweeping the assembled pilots. "She didn't just fit in. She raised our standards, made us better by example, not by preaching." She flew with precision that came from understanding that lives depend on getting it right. She led missions with tactical acumen that comes from having been on the receiving end of air support. And perhaps most importantly, she gradually opened up enough to teach us what those experiences meant. Castellano looked directly at Kincaid. You've made this squadron better. You've made these pilots better. And you're going to make the next generation of naval aviators better. Fallen is lucky to have you, Revenant. The room erupted in applause. Kincaid stood, accepting the ceremonial plaque that marked her time with the squadron, her expression controlled but her eyes betraying emotion she rarely showed. When the applause died down, she stepped to the podium. She prepared remarks, but looking at these faces, pilots who'd become friends, maintenance crews who'd kept her jet perfect, support staff who'd made her transition smooth, the words she'd written felt inadequate. I'm not good at speeches, she began, which got a few sympathetic laughs. Most of my career has been about action, not words, but I'll try. She took a breath. When I transferred here, I wasn't looking for a family. I was running from one. Afghanistan left scars that I thought would never heal, and I convinced myself that staying detached was safer, that if I didn't let anyone in, I wouldn't have to face the pain of losing them. Her voice remained steady but softer. This squadron changed that. You changed that. Not by forcing me to open up, but by showing up consistently, by flying with professionalism, by including me even when I kept my distance. Morrison, Vasquez, Reeves, Kimu made space for someone who didn't know how to ask for it. She glanced at Castellano. And sir, you saw what I was carrying and didn't try to fix it. You just reminded me that my past didn't define my future. That lesson meant more than you know. Back to the room. I'm heading to Fallen to teach weapons and tactics, but what I'm really going to teach is what you all showed me, that excellence and connection aren't mutually exclusive, that you can maintain the highest standards while still caring about the people next to you. That being part of something larger than yourself is what makes the hard days bearable. She held up the plaque. Thank you for reminding me why I wear this uniform. Thank you for making me better. And thank you for giving Revenant a home. The applause this time was thunderous. Pilots stood, clapping and shouting her call sign. Maintenance chiefs whistled. Even the typically reserved administrative staff joined in. Kincaid stood there accepting it. This woman who'd walked out of Afghan mountains carrying dead men's tags, who'd rebuilt herself through flying, who'd finally found a way to honor the past while living in the present. Morrison was the first to reach her when the ceremony ended, his handshake firm. You're going to do great things at Fallen, Revenant, but don't forget where you came from. Never, she said. This squadron made me remember what I was fighting for. The party continued for hours, stories flowing as freely as the beer. But eventually, Kincaid found herself alone on the flight line, watching the sun set over the Pacific. A Super Hornet sat nearby in maintenance, its gray camouflage painted gold by the dying light. Beautiful and lethal, tool and weapon, exactly like she'd become. Footsteps approached from behind. Reeves joined her silently, hands in his pockets. You okay? Yeah, she said, just saying goodbye. Her final flight with the squadron came the next morning. A simple training hop, nothing fancy, just good flying with good people. Castellano led the four-ship, with Kincaid as his wingman, Morrison and Reeves rounding out the formation. They climbed into clear California sky, the Pacific Ocean spreading blue and vast to the west, the Sierra Nevada mountains rising stark to the east. For 90 minutes they flew formation aerobatics, practiced tactical approaches, ran through communication drills. It was flying for the pure joy of it, without the pressure of evaluation or the weight of combat scenarios. Just four pilots and their aircraft, dancing through the sky with the precision that came from mutual trust and shared experience. Castellano's voice came over tactical frequency, relaxed and conversational. Revenant lead, you ready for Fallen? Ready as I'll ever be, sir. They're getting someone special, make sure they know it. I'll do my best, Morrison chimed in from his position. And when you train the next generation of hot shots, tell them about that search and rescue mission. About what it means to find people when everyone else has given up. Copy that. They flew in comfortable silence after that, the kind of quiet that exists between people who understand each other beyond words. When they finally landed and taxied back to the line, Kincaid shut down her engines for the last time at Lemoore and sat in the cockpit for a long moment, committing the feeling to memory. The sun on the canopy, the smell of jet fuel, the satisfied exhaustion of muscles that had fought G-forces for an hour and a half. This was what she'd fought for in Afghanistan. This was what she'd survived for, not the medals or the commendations or even the personal validation, but this simple, perfect moment of having done something difficult well, surrounded by people who understood. Rodriguez was waiting when she climbed down, his weather-worn face breaking into a rare smile. "Brought you back clean like always, ma'am. You kept this jet perfect, Chief. Thank you for that. Fallen's gain is our loss. Whoever gets to maintain your aircraft there better meet standards. I'll make sure they do." She shook his hand, then walked toward the hangar where her squadron mates were gathering. There were more handshakes, more well-wishes, more promises to stay in touch that they'd all try to keep. But eventually the crowd thinned and she found herself loading her truck for the drive to Nevada, her life compressed into duffel bags and cardboard boxes. Castellano helped carry the last load, then leaned against the truck bed. "You know what the most impressive thing about you is, Kincaid?" "What's that, sir?" "You came here broken and convinced yourself you were fine. Now you're leaving whole and pretending you don't feel anything." He smiled. "But I see it. You're going to miss this place. These people." "That's growth." She didn't deny it. "Yes, sir, I am." "Good, hold on to that. Being a good instructor means remembering what it felt like to be human, not just a perfect flying machine." "I'll try, sir." "And Revenant," he met her eyes directly. "3 men died in Afghanistan, but you survived. At some point, you need to forgive yourself for that. Not because you did anything wrong, but because carrying that guilt forever doesn't honor them living fully does." The words hit harder than any tactical criticism ever had. She blinked away unexpected moisture. "I'll work on it, sir. That's all anyone can do." The drive to Fallen took 6 hours through high desert country that seemed to stretch forever in all directions. Kincaid drove with the windows down, letting the wind rush through the cab, watching the landscape shift from California's coastal beauty to Nevada's stark minimalism. Somewhere near the state line, she pulled over at a rest stop and walked to a viewpoint overlooking miles of empty sagebrush and distant mountains. The seal trident was in her pocket. She'd taken it from the sock drawer before leaving, uncertain why but following instinct. Now she pulled it out and held it up to the sunlight, watching how the gold finish caught and reflected the harsh desert brightness. 3 men had died so she could carry this symbol. Master Chief Daniels, who taught her how to read terrain like a language. Petty Officer Garcia, who'd covered her withdrawal when they got ambushed. Lieutenant Commander Hoskins, who'd been their team leader and had ordered her to run when it became clear not everyone would make it out. She carried their tags for 40 miles, delivered them to the forward operating base, attended memorial services where she stood silent and dry-eyed while families wept. And then she'd locked that pain away so deep she'd almost convinced herself it didn't exist. But Castellano was right. Surviving wasn't betrayal. It was obligation to live well, to serve honorably, to make their sacrifice mean something by being the kind of warrior they wanted her to become. "I'm teaching now," she said aloud to the empty desert, "passing on what you taught me, making sure the next generation gets it right." The wind carried her words away into silence. She stood there for several minutes, then carefully placed the trident back in her pocket. Not hidden, not locked away. Just carried, the way you carry memory, present but not overwhelming, part of your story but not the entire narrative. She got back in the truck and continued driving. Fallen appeared on the horizon an hour later, a small town dominated by the massive naval air station that served as the schoolhouse for advanced tactical training. Mountains ringed the valley like sentinels, their peaks still snow-capped despite the late spring warmth. This would be home now. Not just a waypoint or a temporary assignment, but an actual home where she'd put down roots and build something lasting. The base housing office had assigned her a small apartment near the flight line. She spent the evening unpacking, arranging her few possessions in a space that felt temporary despite being permanent. The medals went in a display case this time, not a sock drawer. The trident sat on her desk where she could see it every day. Tomorrow, she'd report to the weapons school for in-processing. Meet her fellow instructors, learn the curriculum, begin the transition from student to teacher. Tonight she allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything that had brought her to this moment: Afghanistan, the mountains, the survival, the slow rebuilding in Lemore, the acceptance that she belonged somewhere. Her phone buzzed with a text from Morrison. "Safe travels. Give 'em hell, Revenant." Then Reeves. "Fallen's getting the best. Make us proud." Then Vasquez, Kim, 3 maintenance chiefs, the Paraloft crew, and finally Castellano. "First day jitters are normal. Remember, you've earned this. Now go teach what matters." She typed responses to each, then set the phone down and walked to her window. The flight line was visible in the distance, rows of Super Hornets and F-16s and other aircraft preparing for tomorrow's training. Somewhere out there were pilots who'd eventually sit in her classroom, who'd listen to her brief tactical scenarios, who'd fly with her and learn what excellence looked like. Some of them would deploy to combat zones. Some would face situations where everything went wrong and survival seemed impossible. And maybe, just maybe, something she taught them would make the difference between coming home and becoming another set of tags carried through hostile territory. That was worth everything. Worth the pain, the struggle, the years of building walls and tearing them down. Worth honoring the dead by serving the living. She touched the window glass, feeling the desert heat still radiating from it despite the setting sun. "I'm ready," she whispered to herself, to the ghosts, to whatever came next. Reporting for duty at the Naval Strike and Air Warfare Center Weapons School felt different than any check-in she'd done before. Kincaid arrived at 0700 in service khakis, her ribbons aligned perfectly, her shoes polished to regulation shine. The main building was modern and purpose-built, all clean lines and glass windows that reflected the morning sun. Inside, the walls were covered with photographs of past instructor classes, combat deployment plaques, and technical diagrams of weapons systems. A young petty officer at the front desk directed her to the commanding officer's suite. Captain Greer was waiting in his office, a compact man with gray hair and sharp eyes that had seen decades of tactical aviation. His walls displayed his own impressive career: combat deployments, previous instructor tour, command pennants. He stood when she entered and extended his hand. "Captain Kincaid, welcome to Fallen. I've heard good things about you from several sources." "Thank you, sir. I'm honored to be here." "Let's skip the formalities for a moment." He gestured to a chair and sat behind his desk. "I read your entire package, not just the Navy records but some of the classified material from your SEAL time. What happened in Afghanistan was extraordinary. How you survived, what you endured, that takes a particular kind of strength." "I did what I had to, sir. More than that, you demonstrated judgment under impossible pressure." He leaned forward slightly. "That's why you're here. We don't just need instructors who can fly well. We need people who can teach decision-making when everything's falling apart, who can convey what combat actually feels like so our students aren't learning those lessons downrange the hard way." Kincaid nodded. "I understand, sir. Do you? Because teaching is harder than flying. In the cockpit, you control variables. In the classroom, you're dealing with egos, varying skill levels, institutional resistance, and the constant pressure of knowing that your students will face real threats based on what you teach them." He paused. "Some combat veterans struggle with that transition. The stakes feel different but just as high." "The stakes are higher, sir," Kincaid said quietly. "When I flew combat, I was responsible for my aircraft and my decisions. As an instructor, I'm responsible for shaping dozens of pilots who will each make thousands of decisions. The ripple effect is exponentially larger." Greer smiled slightly. "Good answer. You're thinking about it correctly." He stood and moved to his window, looking out over the flight line. "Your first class starts in 3 days. You'll co-teach with Commander Maddox Torch, who's been here 2 years and knows the curriculum inside out. Learn from him, find your teaching style, and don't try to be someone you're not. These students will respond to authenticity." "Yes, sir. One more thing." He turned back to face her. "Your call sign carries weight. The story behind it will spread quickly among students. Don't hide from it, but don't let it define your entire teaching identity either. You're Revenant, yes, but you're also a tactical expert with skills beyond survival. Balance those pieces." "Understood, sir." The first meeting with fellow instructors happened an hour later in the main briefing room. 8 people, all experienced combat pilots, all carrying their own stories of deployment and tactical evolution. Commander Maddox Storch was a tall black man with an easy smile and reputation for demanding perfection. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, call sign Knife, specialized in surface attack tactics and had flown 3 deployments. The others represented a cross-section of naval aviation excellence, multiple aircraft types, various specialties, unified by commitment to teaching the next generation. Torch approached Kincaid after the initial meet and greet. "So you're my new co-instructor. Heard you had an interesting board interview." "I survived it." "That's appropriate," he grinned. "Come on, let me show you around and we'll talk about our first class." They walked through the weapons school facilities classrooms equipped with advanced simulation systems, briefing rooms with wall-sized displays, a library containing decades of tactical publications, and offices where instructors planned curriculum and evaluated student performance. Torch explained the teaching philosophy as they walked. "We're not here to make students afraid of combat. We're here to make them competent enough that fear doesn't paralyze decision-making. Everything we teach connects to a real scenario where someone's life depends on getting it right." He opened a door to one of the simulation labs. "This is where we run tactical scenarios. Students plan missions, execute them in simulation, then we debrief every decision. It's as close to combat pressure as we can create without actual threats." Kincaid studied the setup: multiple workstations, large screens showing tactical displays, communication systems that replicated radio environments. Impressive. It is, but technology only goes so far. The real teaching happens in debrief, when we force students to articulate why they made specific choices. That's where judgment gets refined. He looked at her directly. "From what I hear, you've got a gift for that, making people think about the second and third order effects of their decisions." "I had good teachers, and I paid attention to what worked and what got people killed. Perfect foundation for this job." They grabbed coffee in the instructor lounge and Torch pulled out a binder containing the next class roster. 14 students, captains and commanders from various squadrons, all selected for their potential to become tactical leaders and eventually instructors themselves. "These are solid pilots," Torch said, flipping through their records. "But solid isn't enough anymore. The threat environment is evolving faster than our doctrine. We need them thinking creatively while maintaining discipline. That's a hard balance." Kincaid scanned the names and background information. Most had combat deployments. Several had distinguished themselves in recent operations. All carried the kind of confidence that came from being very good at their jobs. "They're going to push back," she observed. "Students this experienced usually have strong opinions about tactics." "Good. We want them pushing back. That's how doctrine evolves, through informed debate. Our job is making sure they can defend their positions with logic and evidence, not just intuition and bravado." He closed the binder. "First class session is Monday. We'll start with threat analysis, current and emerging systems, how adversaries are adapting, what that means for our tactics. I'll lead, you observe and chime in when you have value to add. Then we'll switch roles for the next session." "Sounds good." Torch studied her for a moment. "Can I ask you something about Afghanistan?" Kincaid tensed slightly but nodded. "Go ahead. When you were carrying those tags through enemy territory, how'd you maintain tactical thinking? Most people in survival situations regress to instinct and emotion. You clearly didn't." She considered the question carefully. "I compartmentalized, made a mental box for the grief and fear and locked it tight. Then I focused on the mission: navigate to friendly lines, avoid enemy contact, preserve the tags. Every decision got evaluated against those objectives. Emotion became irrelevant. And after, when you made it out, the box opened whether I wanted it to or not." Her voice was matter of fact. "That's when things got hard, but by then I was safe enough to fall apart." Torch nodded slowly. "That's the piece we need to teach. Not the falling apart part, everyone learns that on their own. But the compartmentalization skill, the ability to function when everything's wrong." "Agreed, though I'm not sure it's fully teachable. Some of it comes from experience." "Then we simulate experience. Put them under enough stress in training that they learn the skill before they need it for real. The first class session arrived with the weight of institutional expectation. 14 students filed into the briefing room precisely on time, each carrying notebooks and tablets, their flight suits bearing patches from their squadrons and previous deployments. They sized up their instructors with the analytical gaze of professionals who knew excellence when they saw it. Torch stood at the front of the room, relaxed but commanding attention effortlessly. Kincaid sat to the side, positioned where she could observe both students and presentation. "Welcome to Weapons School," Torch began. "You're here because your commands identified you as having the tactical acumen and leadership potential to become experts in naval strike warfare. Over the next 6 months, we're going to refine that potential into capability." He advanced the presentation slide, showing a map of current global hotspots. The threat environment is more complex than at any point in recent history. Near-peer adversaries with advanced air defense systems, electronic warfare capabilities that can disrupt our communications, anti-ship missiles that outrange our weapons. The days of uncontested air superiority are over. One student raised his hand, a commander named Patterson with combat ribbons from 3 deployments. "Sir, how do we adapt doctrine when the threat evolves faster than our acquisition cycle? We're still flying aircraft designed 20 years ago against systems that came online last year." Torch smiled. "Good question. Captain Kincaid, you want to take this one?" She stood smoothly and walked to the front. All eyes tracked her movement, assessing, wondering about the instructor with the unusual background. "The aircraft platform matters less than how you employ it," she said. F-18 wasn't designed for the current threat environment, but neither was the AK-47 designed for modern warfare. Both are still relevant because operators adapted tactics to maximize strengths and mitigate weaknesses. She brought up a tactical diagram showing surface-to-air missile engagement zones. "You can't outrun modern SAMs. You can't always jam them. But you can employ terrain masking, electronic attack coordination, and standoff weapons to degrade the enemy's kill chain." "The platform hasn't changed, your thinking has to." Patterson nodded, impressed despite himself. Another student, a captain named Mercer, spoke up. "Ma'am, your background includes ground combat operations. How does that perspective change how you teach air tactics?" "It makes me ruthlessly focused on coordination," Kincaid said. "When I was on the ground calling in close air support, my life depended on pilots understanding exactly what I needed and delivering it precisely. There's no room for error when ordnance is landing 100 meters from friendly positions." She met his eyes directly. "So when I teach you strike tactics, I'm not thinking about your comfort or your sortie statistics. I'm thinking about the team on the ground who needs you to get it exactly right. That changes the acceptable margin for error." The room went quiet. Several students nodded slowly. This was the kind of instruction they'd come to Fallen to receive, teaching grounded in reality rather than theory. Torch resumed the brief, walking through current threat systems with technical detail and tactical implications. He covered radar types, missile kinematics, electronic warfare techniques, and the integration of systems into layered defenses that made penetration increasingly difficult. Throughout the presentation, students took notes and asked informed questions. Halfway through the session, Torch paused and looked at Kincaid. "Revenant, walk them through how you'd plan a strike against this target set." He displayed a complex scenario, a high-value target deep in denied territory, protected by overlapping SAM coverage and enemy fighters. Kincaid stepped forward and studied the display for a long moment, her tactical mind automatically breaking down the problem into manageable pieces. The students watched her process, seeing wheels turn behind those focused eyes. "First question," she said, "what's the objective? Destroy the target, damage it enough to disrupt operations, or conduct a demonstration strike to signal political resolve?" A lieutenant commander named Hayes responded. "Does it matter? Target destruction is the goal regardless." "It matters enormously," Kincaid countered. "If we need complete destruction, that requires heavy ordnance and multiple hits, which means longer time over target and higher exposure to defenses. If disruption is sufficient, we can use standoff weapons and reduce risk. Strategy drives tactics always. She turned back to the display. Second consideration, when do we strike? The SAM systems have vulnerabilities during specific maintenance windows. The enemy fighters have finite combat air patrol endurance. Timing isn't arbitrary. Mercer raised his hand. But we don't always control timing. Sometimes political considerations or fleeting intelligence drives immediate action. True, which is why we prepare multiple courses of action. Kincaid pulled up a tactical planning tool. Course of Action 1. Optimal strike during enemy vulnerability window. Course of Action 2. Acceptable strike during standard alert posture. Course of Action 3. Emergency strike when conditions are terrible but mission is critical. She began sketching the first course of action, her fingers moving quickly across the digital display. COA 1. We use ISR assets to confirm the maintenance window for the SA-21 system here. Launch a 4-ship of F-18s with HARM missiles to suppress the SA-11 batteries on the western approach. Simultaneously, launch EA-18 Growlers to jam early warning radars. It creates a 30-minute window where this corridor is degraded. Students leaned forward, following her logic. While the corridor is open, send a penetrating strike package 8 jets with precision-guided munitions. 4 engage the primary target. 4 provide top cover against enemy fighters. Time on target is 4 minutes maximum. Egress using different routing to prevent pattern establishment. Patterson studied the plan. What if the SA-21 isn't actually down for maintenance? What if it's a deception? Then people die, Kincaid said flatly, which is why intelligence validation is critical and why we don't commit forces until we have multiple source confirmation. That's the cost of operating in denied territory. The margin for error approaches 0. She pulled up the second course of action. COA 2. We can't wait for optimal conditions, so we increase our suppression package. More harm shots, more jamming, more aircraft. This is louder and more expensive, but it creates sufficient degradation through brute force application of electronic warfare and kinetic effects. The session continued for another 90 minutes, with Kincaid and Torch alternating between presenting material and facilitating discussion. Students were engaged, asking hard questions, challenging assumptions, proposing alternative approaches. This was exactly the kind of tactical dialogue that refined doctrine. When they finally broke for lunch, students filed out in animated discussion about what they'd learned. Several lingered to ask follow-up questions, which both instructors welcomed. As the room emptied, Torch turned to Kincaid with an approving nod. That was outstanding. You engaged them at exactly the right level, respected their experience while pushing them to think deeper. They're smart, made it easy. Smart students are actually harder to teach. They have strong priors that resist change. You cut through that by grounding everything in operational reality. The afternoon session shifted to simulation exercises where students would apply morning concepts in dynamic scenarios. The simulation lab was set up with multiple workstations, each representing an aircraft in the strike package. Students would plan the mission, execute it against a realistic threat simulation, and then debrief outcomes in painful detail. Torch explained the exercise parameters. You're planning and executing the strike we discussed this morning. You have 2 hours to plan, then we run the simulation. I'll play the enemy commander, adapting my defenses based on what you do. Revenant will observe and evaluate your decision-making process. The students organized quickly, naturally falling into roles: mission commander, package commander, strike leads, support elements. Kincaid watched them work, noting leadership dynamics, communication patterns, how they handled disagreement. Patterson emerged as the natural mission commander, coordinating different elements and keeping planning on schedule. Mercer focused on weapons employment calculations. Hayes managed the electronic warfare integration. It was a talented group working smoothly together. 2 hours later, they entered the simulation. Kincaid stood in the back of the room while students took their positions at workstations. Large screens showed tactical displays: aircraft positions, threat rings, terrain features. The simulation began with the strike package launching and transiting toward the target area. Almost immediately, complications arose. Torch, playing the adversary, had positioned his SAM system slightly differently than the briefed intelligence indicated. The students adapted quickly, redirecting their suppression package. But then enemy fighters appeared earlier than expected, forcing a decision about whether to continue or abort. Patterson's voice came through the command net. Strike package, continue. Flight 3, engage fighters. All other elements maintain timeline. The decision was sound. They had sufficient combat air patrol to handle the interceptors without degrading the strike, but it increased complexity and stress. Kincaid made notes on her tablet. Mission commander maintained composure under pressure. Decisive allocation of resources. The simulation continued with increasing intensity. Electronic warfare systems partially degraded enemy radars but didn't achieve full suppression. SAMs activated and launched at the penetrating strikers. Students had to employ countermeasures, take evasive action, and still prosecute the target. It was chaos, beautiful, controlled chaos that looked remarkably similar to real combat operations. 4 minutes later, the simulation ended with the target destroyed but 2 simulated aircraft damaged by SAM fragments. Not a perfect outcome, but an acceptable one given the degraded conditions. As the screens went dark, Torch called everyone to the main briefing room for debrief. This was the critical teaching moment, taking the raw experience and extracting lessons that would translate to future operations. He started with Patterson. Mission Commander, walk us through your key decision points. Patterson stood, his expression thoughtful. First major decision was continuing past the early fighter intercept. I assessed we had sufficient assets to handle them without mission degradation. Second was accepting degraded electronic warfare rather than aborting. The window was still usable even if not optimal. Why take those risks? Torch pressed. Because aborting means restarting the whole planning cycle and potentially missing the window entirely. The risks were manageable given our training and capabilities. Torch nodded. Revenant, your assessment. Kincaid stood and addressed Patterson directly. Your decisions were sound, but your communication could be clearer. When you directed Flight 3 to engage fighters, you said engage. That's ambiguous. Engage defensively or prosecute kills. In combat, ambiguity costs seconds that matter. Patterson absorbed the criticism professionally. Understood, ma'am. I should have specified defensive engagement, maintain position relative to strike package. Exactly. She turned her attention to the broader group. Let's talk about the 2 aircraft that took damage. Hayes, you were managing electronic warfare. Why didn't the jamming fully suppress the SA-11 system that scored hits? Hayes stood, checking his notes. The system was operating in a mode we didn't anticipate. It used intermittent emissions that made it harder to track and target with HARM missiles. And when you recognized the mode change, Kincaid pressed. I called it out, but we were already committed to the attack run. That's where the learning point is, Kincaid said, her tone not harsh but absolutely clear. You recognized the problem, verbalized it, but didn't advocate for a solution. What should you have done? Hayes thought carefully. Recommended the strike leads adjust their approach angle to minimize exposure to that threat while still prosecuting target. Better, but even more fundamentally, you should have gamed this scenario during mission planning. Enemy doctrine includes mode variation specifically to defeat our electronic attack. If we'd pre-briefed this possibility, we'd have had immediate countermeasures ready instead of reacting surprised. She let that sink in before continuing. Combat is about anticipating problems before they become crises. We can't predict everything, but we can study adversary doctrine and tactics to reduce surprise. That's homework, studying threat systems not just in terms of their specifications but how adversaries employ them. Mercer raised his hand. Ma'am, how much emphasis should we put on threat study versus perfecting our own tactics? There's limited time and mental bandwidth. False dichotomy, Kincaid responded. You can't perfect tactics without understanding the threat. They're integrated. Every tactical decision exists in the context of what the enemy can do. Tactics divorced from threat reality are just airshow maneuvers. The debrief continued for 90 minutes, dissecting every phase of the mission with surgical precision. Students learned where their planning had gaps, where their communication needed refinement, where their tactical assumptions didn't match operational reality. It was challenging, borderline uncomfortable, but everyone recognized the value. As the session ended and students filed out, Lieutenant Commander Hayes approached Kincaid. "Ma'am, thank you for the feedback on threat anticipation. That was a blind spot I didn't realize I had." "That's why you're here," she said, "to identify blind spots before they matter downrange." "Can I ask, when you were doing ground combat operations, did you have similar learning experiences? Moments where you realized you'd been preparing for the wrong problem?" Kincaid paused, deciding how much vulnerability was appropriate. "Yes. My first deployment, I was so focused on radio communications and coordination procedures that I neglected terrain analysis. Almost got my team ambushed because I picked a position with dead space I didn't recognize. My team leader tore me apart in the debrief professionally but thoroughly." "What you do?" "Spent the next month studying terrain interpretation until I could read ground like a language. The skill set that almost killed us became one of my strengths." She met his eyes. "That's the pattern. Find the weakness, address it obsessively until it's no longer a limitation. Repeat forever." Hayes nodded slowly. "That's a good framework. Thank you, ma'am." After he left, Torch appeared beside Kincaid. "You're a natural at this. The students are responding well. They're challenged but not defensive. That's the sweet spot. They're professionals, makes it easier. Don't undersell yourself. Not everyone can deliver hard feedback in ways that land constructively." He checked his watch. "You've got the evening off. First day teaching is exhausting even when it goes well. Decompress, and we'll do it again tomorrow." Kincaid nodded and gathered her materials. On her way out, she passed the simulation lab where students were already gathering informally to discuss the day's lessons. Good sign. Learning extending beyond formal instruction meant they were engaged. The weeks that followed established a rhythm. Morning classroom instruction covering tactical theory, threat analysis, weapons employment doctrine. Afternoon simulations putting theory into practice under increasing stress. Evening debriefs extracting lessons from the chaos. Kincaid found herself genuinely enjoying teaching in ways she hadn't anticipated. There was satisfaction in watching students grasp complex concepts, in seeing tactical understanding deepen, in knowing that the lessons she taught might save lives months or years from now. Her relationship with the students evolved from formal instructor-student dynamic to something more collegial. They still respected her authority, but increasingly they engaged her in tactical debates during breaks, asked for her perspective on current events, sought her input on career development. She maintained appropriate boundaries, but allowed more of her personality to show through dry humor, occasional war stories from Afghanistan, honest acknowledgement when she didn't know an answer. One afternoon, after a particularly challenging simulation involving simultaneous threats from multiple axes, Patterson approached her in the instructor lounge. "Ma'am, can I ask about your call sign? We've all heard versions of the story, but I'd like to hear it from you." Kincaid poured coffee slowly, buying time to decide how much to share. This was the conversation she'd known would come eventually. "What have you heard? That you were with a SEAL reconnaissance team that got compromised in Afghanistan, that you were declared KIA for 3 days before walking out of the mountains alone, that you carried your teammates' tags the whole way." "That's accurate," she said. "The details are classified, but the broad strokes are public enough." She sat down at one of the tables and Patterson joined her. "Why's the question important to you?" "Because it informs how you teach. You talk about decision-making under pressure not as theory but as survival imperative. You emphasize anticipating problems because you've experienced what happens when surprise becomes catastrophic. I'm trying to understand the full context of your perspective." Kincaid studied him for a moment. Patterson was smart, serious, someone who thought deeply about his profession. The question deserved an honest answer. "My team was conducting reconnaissance in Helmand Province. We got spotted by local militia and had to break contact. During the firefight, we got separated in rough terrain. Radio communications were degraded by the mountains and by enemy jamming. Command couldn't reach us and eventually declared us KIA." She spoke matter-of-factly, keeping emotion out of her voice. "3 of my teammates were killed in the initial contact or died from wounds during the escape. I was the only one who made it to a position where I could signal friendly forces. 72 hours alone, injured in enemy territory. Patterson listened without interrupting. The tags you carried, were they your responsibility as the survivor? Yes. Military tradition and practical necessity. Their families deserve to know what happened and deserve their remains returned. I couldn't carry the bodies, but I could carry the identification. How did that experience change how you approach your job now? It taught me that every decision has weight, that shortcuts in planning or execution can cost lives, that excellence isn't optional, it's the minimum acceptable standard when other people depend on you. She met his eyes, and it taught me that survival sometimes means accepting help. I wouldn't have made it out without close air support that found me and protected my position until rescue arrived. Those pilots saved my life, which is part of why I'm so focused on teaching you to be better. Patterson nodded slowly. That's powerful context. Thank you for sharing. Don't treat it like secret knowledge. The lessons are what matter, not the story. Understood, ma'am. As the weeks progressed, the curriculum intensified. Students moved from basic tactical scenarios to complex multi-domain operations involving surface ships, submarines, electronic warfare assets, and strike fighters, all coordinating against sophisticated adversary networks. The simulations became more difficult, with Torch and Kincaid deliberately introducing complications: equipment failures, communication breakdowns, intelligence errors, political constraints that limited weapons employment. One particularly challenging scenario involved a time-sensitive strike against enemy missile launchers preparing to fire on friendly naval forces. The students had 30 minutes from intelligence notification to weapons on target, barely enough time to plan and execute even under perfect conditions. Kincaid watched the students scramble through planning, their training and experience evident in how quickly they organized. Patterson immediately assigned roles. Mercer began calculating weapon solutions. Hayes coordinated electronic warfare support. But as they rushed to meet the timeline, she noticed them cutting corners: abbreviated mission briefs, incomplete contingency planning, communications protocols that weren't fully synchronized. When they entered the simulation, the shortcuts came due. The strike package launched and transited quickly toward the target area, but encountered a pop-up threat that wasn't fully briefed. Confusion on the tactical net. Wasted seconds clarifying responsibilities. By the time they sorted out the communication problems and prosecuted the target, they were 3 minutes past the deadline. In the simulation, that meant friendly ships had been hit by enemy missiles. Notional casualties that would have been real people in actual combat. The debrief was painful. Torch opened by displaying the timeline, showing exactly where delays accumulated. You failed this mission, not because you lacked skill or courage, but because you prioritized speed over thoroughness. Talk to me about what happened. Commander Patterson stood, his face tight with frustration. Sir, we were under time pressure. We made the best decisions we could with the information available and the timeline imposed. Did you? Torch challenged. Or did you make rushed decisions that felt like urgency but were actually sloppiness? We hit the target, 3 minutes late. Your rules of engagement specified weapons on target within 30 minutes to prevent enemy launch. You missed that deadline, which means ships burned and sailors died. Mission failure. The room was silent. Patterson struggled visibly with the criticism. Kincaid decided to intervene. Commander Patterson, walk me through your brief to the strike pilots. What did you tell them? He consulted his notes. I gave them target coordinates, weapons load, expected threats, and egress routing. How long was the brief? Maybe 2 minutes. And what did you leave out? Patterson thought carefully. I didn't fully brief the contingency procedures or communication protocols. Why? Because we didn't have time. Kincaid stood and walked to the front of the room, her expression serious but not angry. This is the fundamental tension in time-sensitive targeting. Urgency creates pressure to move fast, but speed without precision causes failure. You made a classic mistake confusing activity with effectiveness. She brought up the mission timeline on the main display. Look at where you actually spent time. 2 minutes on brief, 6 minutes on transit, 4 minutes sorting out the tactical confusion you created through inadequate briefing. That confusion cost you the mission. If we'd spent more time briefing, we'd have missed the deadline anyway, Mercer objected. Maybe, Kincaid acknowledged. But you'd have failed with a coherent plan executed properly rather than failing because your team didn't know what they were supposed to do. There's a difference. She turned to address the full class. Time-sensitive targeting is one of the hardest challenges in strike warfare because it forces you to make decisions with incomplete information under artificial time pressure. But here's what you need to understand: thoroughness and speed aren't opposites. They're complementary when you've practiced enough. She advanced to a new slide showing standard planning sequences. If you've drilled these procedures until they're automatic, you can brief a complex mission in 4 minutes instead of 20 because everyone knows the template. If your communication protocols are standardized and practiced, you don't waste time clarifying who's responsible for what. Speed comes from preparation, not from cutting corners in the moment. Patterson absorbed this, his frustration shifting to understanding. So the lesson is we should have been better prepared before the scenario started. Partially, but more fundamentally, when you're under time pressure, you need to identify the minimum viable plan, the simplest approach that accomplishes the objective with acceptable risk. You tried to execute a complex plan without sufficient coordination time. A simpler approach with better communication would have succeeded. Torch rejoined the discussion. Let's run it again. Same scenario, same timeline. But this time, Patterson, your first action is to identify your minimum viable plan. What's the simplest approach that works? Patterson stood at the planning board and thought for a moment. Minimum viable, 4 aircraft, direct approach, 1 weapons pass, immediate egress. No elaborate deception or multi-axis attack, just speed and violence of action. Keep going. Electronic warfare focuses only on the immediate threat radars, not comprehensive suppression. We accept higher risk in exchange for simpler coordination. He was working through it in real time. If his standardized target, threats, weapons, bingo, fuel, lost comm procedures, 3 minutes maximum. Everyone knows their role from standard tactics. Kincaid nodded approvingly. Now you're thinking like a combat pilot instead of a mission planner. What else? We pre-brief contingencies for the most likely complications, pop-up threats, weather, weapons malfunctions. Not every possible problem, just the high probability ones. Better. Now execute that plan. They ran the simulation again. This time, Patterson's planning was faster but more coherent. The brief was crisp and clear. The strike package executed with aggressive simplicity, no fancy tactics, just professional violence delivered precisely on target. When the simulation ended, they'd hit the time window with 90 seconds to spare. The debrief was shorter and more positive. Torch walked through what had worked: clarity of communication, simplicity of plan, focus on essential elements. But he also pushed them to recognize that the successful plan had accepted higher risk in exchange for speed. In combat, you'll face this trade-off constantly, he said. Perfect safety versus mission accomplishment. Your job is making informed decisions about acceptable risk, not eliminating risk entirely. That's leadership. As students filtered out, several lingered to discuss the lesson. Kincaid noticed that Patterson stayed behind, reviewing his notes from both runs. She approached him. "You okay, Commander?" He looked up. "Yes, ma'am, just processing. I've done time-sensitive targeting before but never framed it as minimum viable plan versus optimal plan. That's a useful framework. Credit goes to some Army Special Forces guys who taught me planning under pressure. They had a saying, perfect plans executed late accomplish nothing. Good plans executed on time win fights. That's doctrine quality wisdom. Most doctrine is just crystallized lessons from people who survived long enough to write it down." She paused. "You did well recovering from the failure. That's actually more important than succeeding first time, the ability to learn rapidly and adapt." "Thank you, ma'am. Appreciate the instruction." As he left, Torch joined her. "That was masterful teaching. You took a failure scenario and turned it into one of the best learning moments we've had this session. The failure was the teaching tool. I just helped them extract the lesson. Still, you're hitting your stride as an instructor." Kincaid allowed herself a small smile. "Maybe I am. The curriculum progressed into the advanced phase where students began planning and executing multi-day operations, coordinating with simulated joint forces, and dealing with strategic-level considerations beyond pure tactics. These scenarios were designed to prepare students for eventual command positions where they'd have to integrate aviation assets into larger campaigns. One evening, Kincaid was in her office reviewing student performance assessments when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a Virginia area code she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something made her answer. Captain Kincaid. Revenant, it's Castellano. Got a minute? Hearing her former squadron commander's voice brought an unexpected wave of warmth. Sir, of course. How are things at Lemoore? Busy as always. Morrison and Vasquez both got selected for department head positions. Reeves is taking over operations. The squadron's doing well. That's great to hear. How about you, surviving the weapons school instructor life? She leaned back in her chair. More than surviving, actually enjoying it, which surprises me. Teaching is harder than I expected, but more rewarding too. I'm not surprised. You've got a gift for it, the ability to challenge people constructively. He paused. Actually, that's part of why I'm calling. I've been asked to put together a lecture for the Air Wing Commanders Conference next month. Topic is integrating non-traditional warfare experience into conventional aviation operations. Basically, what we learned from having you in the squadron. Kincaid felt tension creep into her shoulders. Sir, I'm not sure I'm comfortable being the subject of a presentation. I understand that, but this isn't about putting you on display. It's about sharing lessons that could help other squadrons be more effective. How to leverage diverse operational backgrounds, how to create environments where non-traditional pipelines can contribute, how to challenge institutional assumptions about what makes someone a good aviator. She considered this. What do you need from me? Honestly, just your permission to tell the story and use your performance as an example. I'll keep it professional and focused on the tactical lessons, not personal details. Okay, permission granted. But keep my Afghanistan stuff to minimum necessary context. Will do. Thank you, Revenant. They talked for another 15 minutes about squadron news and mutual contacts before Castellano had to go. After hanging up, Kincaid sat in her quiet office thinking about how far she'd come from that first awkward morning briefing at Lemoore when nobody knew what to make of her. The following week brought the final examination for her current class, a comprehensive scenario that would test everything they'd learned over 6 months. Students would plan and execute a complex strike operation with minimal instructor guidance, demonstrating tactical proficiency, leadership, and decision-making under pressure. Torch and Kincaid designed the scenario to be challenging, but achievable, exactly the kind of mission students might face in their next combat deployment. The target was a heavily defended command facility requiring coordination between multiple strike packages, suppression of enemy air defenses, combat air patrol to protect against interceptors, and split-second timing to overwhelm defenses. Students had 24 hours to plan before execution. Kincaid observed as they organized themselves, nodding leadership dynamics and planning methodology. Patterson naturally took charge as overall commander, but the team worked more collaboratively than they had at the course beginning. Egos had been tempered by 6 months of being challenged and occasionally failing. They'd learned to value input from their peers and to check their assumptions against operational reality. The planning session was impressive: thorough threat analysis, detailed contingency planning, multiple rehearsals of critical phases. They'd absorbed the lessons about preparation enabling speed and were applying them systematically. When they briefed their plan to the instructors, it was comprehensive and professional. Torch asked probing questions about assumptions and decision points. What if your electronic warfare package gets shot down during ingress? We have backup assets positioned to assume jamming responsibility. The timeline extends by 3 minutes but remains viable. What if intelligence on the target location is wrong and it's not where you expect? We have secondary targets pre-briefed. Strike leads have authority to shift to alternates without requesting permission. What if you lose tactical data link and have to execute under radio communication only? We've pre-briefed communication protocols for degraded conditions. Package commanders have full timeline and contingencies memorized. They had answers for everything. The preparation was exceptional. Kincaid nodded approvingly. The simulation ran the next morning with both instructors and several senior officers from the base observing. This was the culmination of 6 months of intensive training, and everyone wanted to see how the students performed. The scenario began with intelligence briefing on the target timing, location, defenses. Students launched their strike packages precisely on schedule, multiple elements lifting off and forming up with practiced efficiency. Communications were crisp and professional as they transited toward the target area. Then the complications began. Torch, playing adversary commander, activated SAM systems in unexpected configurations. Enemy fighters appeared from an unexpected direction. Weather degraded visibility over the target.